Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Conservation Symposium. My name is JOAO VIDAL. I'm an ecologist. I'm from Brazil, and I'm working now at the University of the Free State as a postdoc. And today I will be sharing with you a few insights and some updates on our results in developing indicators for changes in mountain grasslands on the Eastern Escarpment, with a special focus on developing locally suitable approaches for tracking climate change and land use change in these environments. So I think most of you will agree with me that it is such an exciting time for studying mountains. 2 months ago, we just had the third International Mountain Conference in Innsbruck, Austria, and also in September, the latest IPCC report came out, and for the first time in more than 20 years, mountains got a chapter of their own. And I think that this might be because stakeholders, they're finally realizing how disproportionately important these environments are and how vulnerable they also are. So the concerning part is, however, that if we go through the chapter, we are able to see how especially underrepresented African mountains are. In fact, it is the only continent in the world not represented in any one of the maps where it was used as a placeholder to fit data on Asia, as you can see here on this map on the bottom. And if you go through the author list, you can have a clue on why is that. You have 14 authors, 14 main authors, and 41 contributors, and not a single one of them is from an African country. You have people from all over the world, but not a single African. And it's not like mountains are distant from the African reality. If you look at this topographic map, you can see that they dominate almost the entire continent. Also, this map on the left, it's the Afro-Montane region as a biogeographic region described by White. And the map on the right is the population growth in Africa for the past 2 decades. And if you overlap these two, it's an exact match. And actually, even though they're not classified as part of the classic Afro-Montane definition, Northern Africa and Madagascar are also in the mountains. So that means that the most rapid population growth zones in Africa are in fact on the mountains. And here is where things get concerning. This is United Nations data, and this is the population growth projection for the entire world for the next century. And as you can see, Africa is expected to face a demographic explosion. In fact, in the middle of the next century, it will become the only place in the world to sustain a rapid population growth. And this has tremendous implications for natural resources management and for biodiversity conservation. And African mountain ecosystems, they are among the most diverse in the world. Both Cape Floristic region and the succulent Karoo are listed among the 20 biodiversity hotspots on the classic Myers paper. And when it comes to richness, the eastern part of the continent is also very important. You can see this on this map. This is actually vertebrate species richness, but most of the diversity is concentrated on the eastern part. And African mountains, they are also very different in terms of vegetation when compared to the rest of the world. You can see that a great proportion of the mountains in Africa are dominated by grasslands. And in fact, Africa has the highest proportion of grassland-dominated mountains in the world, as you can see here on this first map. Well, the first one, it is actually the grass cover per cell. So blue tones, they represent cells with no grasses, and the red tones, they represent cells totally occupied by grasses. So I made a categorical version of this map. It's the second one, and you can see there are the darker tones of red, they represented mountains dominated by grasslands. And you can see that it's the majority of the mountains in Africa and also in Asia. But for Europe and America, you almost have no grass-dominated mountains. And here, when we take in account also the pampas and the savannas and the wetlands that are also grassland biomes, things also look very interesting for Africa. We have a total of 11 mountains occupied by grassland biomes, and compared to 5 in South America, 3 in Europe, and 3 in Australia. And if I did the maths right, that means that Africa has more grasslands than all these places combined. And the fact that they are so unique and different from the European mountains results in some challenges in the current knowledge of these environments. And as you can see, the Southern Hemisphere is generally less represented in literature when compared to Northern Hemisphere. And as a result, there are many misconceptions. For example, about the presence of trees and the natural occurrence of fire in these environments, and also if these are naturally occurring environments or they're anthropogenic. So when you look at the available tools for tracking climate change in mountains, while you have the tree lines for the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Afro-Montane is dominated by grasslands, and that makes it impossible to use such a tool as a tree line. So we need to think about alternative ways of measuring environmental change. And when we talk about grassy mountains in Africa, maybe the most famous ones, at least for me, are on the Eastern Escarpment, which comprises the Maloti Drakensberg, the Mpumalanga Limpopo, Cape Midlands, and also the Manica Highlands. And specifically, these southern mountain ecosystems account for more than 7,000 species of plants, with more than 60% of endemics. If we compare that with the Cape Floristic region, for example, where you have 9,000 species with 70% endemics, and they're also very similar in size, so it's noteworthy. And this is somewhat surprisingly because at a first glance, these landscapes, they look species poor because due to the fact that the vegetation is mostly comprised by grasses, and grass taxonomy is quite challenging and much less appealing than the beautiful proteas that you have in the Cape. So why should we be worried about climate change in mountain grasslands? Well, it happens that these species, they are especially sensitive to climate change. Mountains often, they constitute this juxtaposition of pretty narrow environmental envelopes. So species, they usually have to adjust their distributions following a very accelerated pace of change when it comes to temperature changes, as we could see, for example, during the glaciations. The problem seems to be that the current climatic changes, they are occurring in a much faster rate than most of species are actually able to track. So also the upper belts of the mountains, they are being pushed towards higher elevations, and this is limited by the own height of the mountain. So that means that higher temperatures will necessarily lead to habitat loss in mountains. And in fact, some available simulations predict that most of the endemics in the mountains will undergo range retractions in the next 50 years. And not only habitat loss is an issue. Another impact of climate change and land use change in mountains is also the increase of mountains' vulnerability to invasive species. As you can see on the scheme, mountains naturally have some barriers to resist biological invasions, and because we know that climate is usually very severe on mountain tops. And this leads to a relative lower human disturbance and consequently to a reduced propagal pressure when it comes to invasives. But most of these defenses, they're being weakened by human activity and allowing lowland and invasive species to take over. So this is already happening in a worldwide scale. In Europe, for example, you have long-term studies and historical series showing that plant communities in mountains are already being occupied by lowland species all across the continent. And this is some data from Steinbauer and collaborators, where they were able to gather floristic surveys since the late 19th century up to nowadays, and they were able to show that there was an increase in species richness on mountaintop communities, and this is correlated with the global increase in temperature, as you can see on the right figure, for every mountain they analyzed. So the yellow lines on the bottom are species richness, and on the box above it, you have the temperature change. You can see that it matches perfectly. But we don't have that much data for the African mountains, unfortunately. So we can't be sure if similar processes are taking place here, because African mountain environments and their species, they are substantially different from the Northern Hemisphere and European ones. So within this context, our objective was to develop locally suitable approaches To address these important ecological questions and to help filling this gap that we have on these mountains, on how are they being affected by climate change. And for that, we are using the Eastern Great Escarpment as a case in point. And maybe the most important reason for tracking biodiversity loss is generally justified by the fact that biodiversity plays a fundamental role in the functioning of ecosystems and also in ecosystem services. Different species, they do occupy different niches within the communities, so they might have an equal importance when it comes to nutrient cycling and water, for example. And these different functional groups, they also interact with each other and also with the abiotic drivers in very unique ways. So biodiversity loss may have an equal impact in many of these natural cycles. This is the case, for example, of the keystone species. These are species which, when removed, they have disproportional impacts on the whole system. So when we talk about ecosystem services in the African mountains, we're talking surely about water. Most of the water supply of the major cities on the west, on the east, is produced in the mountains. And as we are already seeing, this resource is already limited for some places. This year we're facing a strong drought in South Africa, and it was not by if it was not by the mountains, things would certainly be worse. So the long-term resilience of mountains and their ecosystem services should be an absolute priority both for research and conservation. And what we are actually seeing in practice is an increase of the presence of invasive trees, especially along the rivers in the mountains. So this has long-term negative impacts on the whole functioning of the drainage systems. These trees, they increase the ecophysiological pressure and soil erosion, and they unbalance the hydric equilibrium, what in dry environments like the grasslands is extremely harmful because water is so limited. So we actually have some data quantifying that. One of our collaborators, Dr. Michelle Toucher, she measured the amount of water deficit caused by wood encroachment in the Drakensberg to be able to understand how trees are affecting the river flow. And here we have a site where the fire was removed since the 70s, and they compared it to a regularly burned landscape under the same catchment. And they actually found out that under the exact same rainfall, there's a significant decrease in the stream flow in the site where the woody coverage increased and the fire was removed. So this is an alert of how endangered the whole functioning of these catchments might be by biological invasions. And the increase of woody coverage not also affects the stream flow, but also negatively impacts the community composition in terms of richness. This is some data from the Johannesburg grasslands, and we have the richness of herbs per plot compared to the woody coverage in each plot. And as you can see, there's a clear reduction in herbs richness in sites where trees took over. So I want to present you now a new tool that we're conceiving to use community changes as an indicator for climate change in the grasslands. It is based on the knowledge about physiology and climate, and on this graph on the left, it is shown what most of you already know, that warmer temperatures and lower concentrations of CO2 favor metabolically the C4 grasses. So this explains why we see this kind of pattern here on the right in community composition shift. This is some data from Sieben and collaborators, and you can see that in the wetlands of the Drakensberg, you have this pattern of C3 grasses increasing towards higher elevations. C4 grasses, on the other hand, are more abundant in lower elevation sites, and this clearly shows us a trend. But we know that the elevation per se, it's what we call a surrogate variable. It cannot determine the distribution of organisms alone, but it does determine the distribution of climatic zones. So here is what we found. We actually compiled species lists and occurrence records for all the Poaceae occurring in the Eastern African mountains, and we plotted the proportion of each elevation belt which was occupied by C3 and C4 grasses. So here in orange we have the Cape Midlands, and in light blue the Maloti Drakensberg, in dark blue the Mpumalanga Limpopo, and in green the Manica Highlands. And you can see that on every one of these mountains, C3 proportion always increases towards the top, but in different rates. And why are these rates so different? Well, we can have a clue if we look at the environmental space occupied by each one of these mountains. So here we have a representation of all the environmental space available on Earth. And on the y-axis, you have the annual precipitation. On the x-axis, it's annual mean temperature. And each one of the colored polygons, they represent one of the mountains. And you can see that there are some overlap, but mostly these mountains, they constitute what we call a climatic gradient. So the EGA mountains, they're not exactly the same when it comes to climate. So let's take these environmental factors aside and have a look at each one of them in greater detail. If we compare precipitation and temperature individually, you can see that the difference is very clear. You have actually the temperature being more similar between Cape Midlands and Melotti-Drakensberg, while it's different in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and Manica Highlands. It is a gradient from the southwest to the northeast, and the same happens with precipitation. And if we put all the mountains together and look individually to the relationship between each one of these environmental variables and the proportion of C3 grasses per site, we can see that there is in fact a negative correlation. It is more clear for temperature, but as you can see, but the overall message that we get from these graphs is that sites where temperature and precipitation are higher, there is a decrease in the proportion of C3 grasses present in communities. Oops. Okay. We also know that temperature and precipitation, they vary along a latitudinal and elevation gradient in the form of the isotherms. And about 2 centuries ago, Alexander von Humboldt, he identified these climatic biologic unities, but within a northern hemisphere context. If you look at this scheme, you can see that the biological component that von Humboldt used, it's quite different from the ones that we have in southern hemisphere, since trees are often absent in the mountains, as I showed earlier. So if we insert the community composition turnover that we found for the EGA in this Humboldt diagram, we are able to see a pattern. The elevation where C3 gets more frequent than C4, or this turnover point, let's call it this way, it is somewhat analogous to the conifer deciduous forest transition for northern hemisphere mountains in similar latitudes. That means that they occur under the same isotherm. So we summarize these results to try to come out with this Humboldt-like pattern for the C3-C4 transition for the Eastern Great Escarpment. As you can, and you can see that if we establish some C3 proportion thresholds, like 25% or 50%, we're able to come up with a very promising isotherm proxy. You can see that C3 starts to surpass C4 around 14 degrees of annual mean temperature. And we're not able to see the turnover point for Mpumalanga Limpopo, at least the 50% one, and for Manica Highlands, because these mountains, they are not tall enough, but we've shown here that the 25% is in every one of these mountains, and it follows this trend. Also, another startling result that becomes clear with these charts is that the C3 grasses, they occupy a very narrow space in the mountains. And as I showed earlier, these spaces are expected to retract with the temperature increase predicted for the next 50 years. So basically, C3 grasses are, like the rest of us, doomed by climate change. So putting that into a global context, even though there is very limited research available, there are some similar patterns demonstrated for other southern hemisphere mountain grasslands. We do have some studies comparing the C3, C4 species composition, variation along elevation, temperature, and moisture gradients, both for Australia and Argentina. And we can see that, like the African grasslands, there is this increase in C3 grasses towards higher elevations, as we can see this on this graph on the left. And an increase in C4 grasses in higher temperatures and higher water available systems, as reported here for the Australian Alps. If we compare this result with ours, it is in fact an exact match. The same elevation boundaries are associated with the same proportion of C3 grasses, so that's quite impressive. So based on that, we are very confident to suggest that under the same latitudes, C3 increase rate along variation gradients is the same because it's driven by an isotherm. So we recommend this indicator to be used to track temperature changes in mountain grasslands on behalf of and instead of the tree line. So we were very excited about this result when we seen it, and we decided to go further and try to gather data for several other southern hemisphere grassy mountains. And well, guess what? The pattern is repeated. This is the first one on the left is New Zealand, and mountains in New Zealand, they are way colder than the African ones. So the 50% threshold, it is actually lower than the mountain. What makes the whole mountain to be dominated by C3 grasses, you actually don't have C4 grasses on the New Zealand mountains. Like you have a sporadically occurrence of 1 or 2 genera, but most of it is dominated by C3 grasses. So mean temperatures lower than 14 degrees, it seems like a filter too strong to C4 grasses to resist. So we also need to consider the fact that this might be a biogeographic bias because New Zealand's biogeographic history is quite odd, so maybe the C4 genera, they were not able to reach there during the isolation of the post-Gondwana breakup, but that looks promising. On the other hand, here on the right, in more tropical mountains, the climate may be too heterogeneous to allow us to identify this clear transition. But you can see that the 50% threshold, it matches the 14 degree annual temperature isotherm. The problem is with the 25% one. But interestingly, also the interval between the 25 and the 50%, it still looks very similar. It's something around 800 to 1,000 meters. So going beyond the C3, C4 grasses, we can also consider other indicative species as potential indicators for tracking climate change in the mountains. There is this good example of this cushion plant species named Euphorbia clavarioides, to which niche models have identified that temperature is the most important environmental driver on determining the distribution of these species. And we are sure that there are many other endemic mountain taxa that may follow similar patterns, as temperature is often a major filter for species in the mountains. But this list of indicators, it is only useful if we're able to track them over time. And for that, we do need to make efforts to make our studies long-term and to standardize data in a way that it can be used both by local and global communities. So I listed here some of the global programs that are being developed to help researchers to worldwide to establish standardized research protocols in the mountains. We have, for example, the GLORIA program, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, the GEONOM, the MYREN program, and many other ones that I might have missed. And the important thing is that these programs, they allow researchers to share data and to compare outputs and encourages the establishment of long-term study sites in the mountains, which we would definitely benefit of. So to wrap up the message of my presentation, there's a major need to include Southern African mountains in the global stage when it comes to monitoring change. And grassy mountain systems, they need novel and more applicable monitoring methods than they typically in use globally, like replace the tree line thinking with on this C3, C4 ecotone. And Southern African mountains, they also provide a valuable opportunity for these blended protocols that include both relevant global ones and grassy specific ones. So we would like to thank all the collaborators on the University of the Free State, the Afro-Montane Research Unit, the SEIAN, and the University of Pretoria, And I also would like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation to present our research outputs, especially to Franny, which assisted us with the registration and make sure that everything worked really well. And also thanks everyone in the audience for your time and attention, and have a wonderful symposium.